Hey everyone, so in today's video we're going to cover introspective agents. So I've got this notebook here prepared and it's going to cover how we use an introspective agent to perform toxicity reduction. So we should probably begin with what is an introspective agent. So if we recall that an agent is essentially a thing that performs a task, an introspective agent is again a thing that performs a task, but doing so while using reflection. Reflection essentially is a way for the agent to reflect on its initial response to performing that that given task, and then after reflecting on how well it performed on that initial response, it has the opportunity to correct it against that reflection. So an introspective agent is essentially, again, an agent that performs a task, and so it gets an initial response to it, and then it performs successive iterations of reflection and correction until it's reaches a point where it's satisfied with the final response. So we've implemented that reflection design pattern here in a new package called llama-index-agent-introspective, and this notebook will walk through how you can use the main classes contained in that package. So to begin, we need to, of course, install our necessary packages. So they're here. Of course, here you've got the llama-index-agent-introspective. And, a quick setup thing here too. We are going to run some async calls, so we do need an event loop running, and so we'll use nesasyncio. Now, I should warn viewers here that the task here is on toxicity reduction, so there are going to be some content that some may find offensive and sort of disturbing. So warning that that content does exist. So if that's something that is not good for you, then maybe skip the parts when that content is presented in this video. Okay, so what is the task of toxicity reduction? Essentially what we're going to ask the agent to do is we're going to give it a piece of text that is potentially toxic, and then we're going to ask the agent to rewrite this text in a safer way, so one that is less toxic, right? So the introspective agent, again, will do this by first performing the task with an initial response. So it will create a draft of a safer version of that text, and then it will perform reflection on that draft. So that reflection can happen in a few ways, and in this package here we've implemented two different ways of implementing a reflection mechanism. But besides that, after that reflection on that draft is made, then the LLM will also, or the agent rather, will then use a correction step to create a new draft, which is hopefully less harmful, less toxic than the original text. And you can have this agent go through this reflection and correction cycles until one of two things happens. Either it reaches a stopping condition where it views a draft as being satisfactory, or it reaches a user-specified maximum number of iterations. So that is the task, and a little bit again of what is an introspective agent and how reflection is performed. So if we look a little bit closer now into, under the hood of an introspective agent, essentially what we've got is an introspective agent is an agent that actually delegates the task to other agents. So in other words, an introspective agent contains two agents. One we call a main agent, and another one that we call a reflective agent. So what happens when an introspective agent gets a task is essentially it delegates this task to first a main agent that generates that initial response. So in the context of toxicity reduction, it will generate that initial draft of a safer version of the original text, and it will output it here. Then this initial response will go to the reflective agent, which is responsible for performing the reflection and correction cycles until a stopping condition has been met. So again, the task is passed to the introspective agent. The introspective agent delegates that task in sequence to two other agents. The main agent is responsible for generating the initial response, And then that gets passed to the reflective agent that performs the reflection and correction cycles. And then finally, you get a corrected response. So that is our introspective agent. Now, I did mention that there are, at least in this library package, there are two included mechanisms for reflection. So there is one that's called Tool Interactive Reflection Agent, and another one called Self-Reflection. The main difference there is essentially in the first one, Tool Interactive Reflection, we are allowing the agent to use tools in order to perform reflection. So you can think of that as doing a sort of like a fact check on a certain response using an external tool. Whereas in self-reflection, we're just using the LLM itself, its knowledge, obviously pre-trained or fine-tuned, and no external tools. So in this notebook, what we'll do is we'll set up two introspective agents, one using tool interactive reflection and another using self-reflection. And again, these classes are available in the llama-index-agent-introspective integration package. Okay, so in this first part, we'll build that introspective agent with a tool interactive reflection agent. So in this first step here, what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to build a tool which will allow us to get the toxicity score of a piece of text. And that tool will use the Perspective API. And the Perspective API, essentially, in order to be able to use that, you need to enable that in your Google Cloud projects, and then get a set of credentials or an API key that you can then pass through as a Perspective API key environment variable if you are going to use this notebook. I left the link here for you to follow the instructions on how it is that you actually get the credentials to get Perspective running. Now, once you have that running, I've got here essentially just a custom class that will allow us to get that toxicity score on a piece of text. By the way, I should mention that, excuse me, that this tool interactive reflection framework actually came from a paper called Critic by, I forget the fellow's name, but I do have a paper card here, by Zhibin et al. In 2023. So in their example and in their paper, actually, they also use this toxicity reduction example, and they've also made use of Perspective API. So we are, in effect, re-implementing their example. Okay, so in llama-index terms, we have a function, a class that will allow us to get the Perspective API toxicity scores. And then what we need to do is essentially build a function that takes in a piece of text and outputs, a score plus the attribute that score is for. So essentially, Perspective works in a way that it provides scores for each of these attributes. So you've got toxicity, severe toxicity, and all these other ones. For simplicity, and what also the authors of that Critic paper also did, is that they considered this whole, like all these attributes, to be essentially just a bucket of toxicity attributes, and we'll do the same here. So we've got this function essentially that will, again, give us a toxicity score, and we can test that now. So here is a text, right, of friendly greetings from Python. This is, shouldn't be toxic, so let's see. This is in terms of percentage. So it's got a toxicity score of 2.54, which is low on the scale of 0 to 100. Okay, now that we've got our tool, let's build now our tool interactive reflection agent. So that, again, that tool interactive reflection agent uses a tool to perform reflection. So it does a little bit of, for example, like fact checking. In the context of toxicity reduction, what we will do is we'll ask the reflection agent to use this external tool to get the toxicity score of the text in each iteration. So you've got the initial response, then you go through cycles of reflection and correction. And each iteration there, we're going to ask the reflection agent to get the toxicity score. And then in the correction phase, we'll, the agent will use that toxicity score and the attribute in order to improve upon the previous text or the previous draft. Okay, so to build our introspective agent, we need to build first our tool interactive reflection agent. And here I just wrote a quick helper function because we are going to build another one of these things later in the notebook. So I just wrapped this in a function. You really don't have to, but I've done it here again out of convenience. So to build a tool interactive reflection agent worker, we need to first construct something that it needs, which is called the Critic agent worker. So it does a little bit of delegation here as well. It delegates the reflection to this Critic agent, which will make use of the Perspective API tool that we just built. We also need to define an LLM that will construct the corrections against the critique or reflection. And then we'll need to define a stopping condition for the reflection correction cycles. And then we can just, with those elements, we can construct our tool interactive reflection agent. So here are the steps. So the critique agent is going to be a function calling agent worker. So it needs to use functions or tools. And you can see here we're passing it that perspective tool. We're using here GPT 3.5 Turbo, and we're saying please be verbose, or actually default is yes, please be verbose. And in step 2, we need to again define the correction LLM. For corrections, we're going to use GPT-4 Turbo Preview. And this step C, we need to define a stopping condition. So this function here helps us, this function is meant to define how or when these reflection and correction cycles stop. And this function operates on the critique or reflection string. So it takes in the string and outputs a Boolean. And so what we are going to be looking for, because we're going to prompt the agent as such, is we're going to look for the string pass in the critique string. If this is in there, then the stopping condition should be met. Okay, and in this last step D here, we're going to finally build our reflection agent worker, and we've got a convenience constructor method called from defaults here. And here you could provide the critique agent worker, the template. So here again, we pass in that instruction to say write pass, otherwise write fail if the toxicity score is less than 3. So those two, this string or this string should be in that critique string. Then we have our stopping condition and our correction LLM. And so that defines our tool interactive reflection agent. And then in step 2, we can define our main agent worker. So if you recall, the introspective agent delegates the task to 2 agents, the main worker that is responsible for generating the initial response, and then the reflection agent that's responsible for performing the reflection and correction cycles. Now, the way that we've implemented it is that the main worker actually can be optional. And if it's a none type, then what happens is that we assume that the user input is actually the initial response. So you don't need a main agent to generate that initial response. Okay, with those 2 elements in hand, now we can generate our introspective agent. So we can do that using, again, another convenience constructor called from defaults. We're going to pass in our reflective agent, which is our tool interactive reflective agent, and then our main agent worker, which again by default I believe will be none here. So it's false, therefore it'll go to none. At which point again it will be assumed that the user input is the original response. And we're adding here some chat history, so it's just a prefix of messages that will dictate the system message essentially. So we're saying you're an assistant that generates safer versions of potentially toxic user supplied text. And then the last step here, we go from, one sort of nuancing here is that we go from an agent worker to an actual agent. So we just take that agent worker and run this as agent method. And then we've got our introspective agent by calling that helper function. So now that we've got our introspective agent that uses tool interactive reflection and using here in this case Perplexity API tool, we can test it out. So here's a harmful piece of text that I got as an example from the Critic paper. And we're going to pass this into our introspective agent who will perform toxicity reduction. So it'll take this harmful text and it will create a safer version of it. So since it's verbose, it's printing out all the steps. You can see that it's made a function call to the perspective function tool. This is when it's performing that reflection. And then you can see that initial score is quite high, 50% with the toxicity attribute of insult. And it goes through these iterations until finally it reaches that stopping condition. We said, if finally it gets to a toxicity score of less than 3, then include the string pass within the critique string. So our stopping condition function, correctly noticed this string and said, okay, it's time to stop. We've finally found a good response. And so let's take a look at the response. So here's a corrected version of the input. People who do not eat meat for ethical reasons related to animal welfare are making a personal decision. It's important to respect diverse perspectives and experiences. That does seem indeed to be less harmful than the original text. And we know that this new text has a toxicity score of 1.37 in comparison to the original one, which had 50.72. And here I'm just showing you that you can access the sources that were used by the introspective agent. Again, this was done through delegation, but nevertheless, we surface it up here. So it was actually the critique agent within the reflection agent that made these tool calls, but you could see what's happened there. We also store the the chat history of all the sub-agents within the processing of this task as well in this chat store. Okay, so that's an introspective agent using the tool interactive agent. So the tool interactive reflection agent. So again, there we're performing reflection by using external tools. And in this case, we used a Perspective API tool that we built. So now let's carry on to introspective agents that use self-reflection. Now, I mentioned earlier that the difference between the two reflection mechanisms is that with the tool interactive one, we're using external tools. With self-reflection, we're just using the LLM itself, no external tools. So building this is actually a little bit easier. Again, we've got here a helper function to build the introspective agent with this reflection mechanism. So the steps are pretty similar to before. We need to first define that reflection agent. Then we need to define, the main agent. And then with these two things in hand, we can construct our introspective agent. Remember, again, the introspective agent delegates tasks to these two agents. Okay, so for self-reflection, we can use the convenience constructor, which essentially just uses the LLM. So this LLM will be used for both reflection and correction. And there are default prompts baked into these reflection agents that you can take a look at within the source code. Again, you've got your main worker that is responsible for building or generating that initial response. It is optional here, and we will again set it to none. So we will assume again that the user input is the initial response that we want to reflect and correct on. And then, okay, so with the reflection agent and the main worker agent defined, we can now create our introspective agent, again using the same constructor as before, and the same system method. So everything is pretty much similar. The only difference here is how we build our reflection agent worker. Okay, so now that we've got our introspective agent that uses self-reflection, let's test it out on the same piece of text as before. So again, it's verbose, so it's going through its steps. Again, here with self-reflection, we're not making use of any external tools, so that's why you don't see any tool call to Perspective API. Okay, there we go. It's done. And so now we can take a look at the response. So here again is the corrected version. People who choose not to eat meat for ethical reasons related to animal welfare often spark intense discussions. It's important to remember that individual actions and beliefs can vary widely, and it's not productive to generalize about anyone's character based on their dietary choices. Seems like a pretty fair result. So again, we can access the memory store as before. And one thing that we might be curious to know is actually what is the toxicity score for this one, because again, with self-reflection, we're not using any external tools, but we can for sure, after getting this response, test it out and see what the toxicity score would be. So let's do that now. Okay, so it nets out a toxicity score of 1.2, which if we compare to the Tool Interactive one, is 1.36. So essentially it does it better marginally. And so that's how the self-reflection agent, agent mechanism works with the introspective agent. And finally, in this last section of the notebook, let's do a sort of a mini showdown. And definitely this is going to be super mini. It won't really have statistical significance because I'm not going to use enough examples here. But I will say that at least the results does corroborate the results that were seen or observed in the Critic paper. And I'll get into that now, which is essentially that the tool interactive reflection, if you do have tools that are appropriate for the reflection, using these tools actually yields better responses than using self-reflection mechanics. So in this section, what we'll do is we'll put these two reflection mechanisms to the test and see which one nets out in the smaller toxicity scores. So again, a fair warning here that these examples are, or may be offensive to some. So feel free to skip it if that is the case. I will mention that these examples came from two sources, the Critic paper, as well as Guardrail's AI docs here, which I've linked here. They had 2 or 3 examples that I pulled from. Okay, so what we're going to do is have the introspective agent using, 2 introspective agents, one using self-reflection, one using tool interactive reflection, and both are going to run through these toxic examples and generate safer versions of them. So here are my introspective agents. So as I mentioned before, I created these helper functions because I wanted to create these agents again very simply. And in this time, what I'll do is I'll put verbose equals to false for both. Okay, so now that we've got our examples, as well as our agents, let's just run through a loop that will, have each agent run through those tasks, generating safer versions of them. Okay. And while this is going, what I'll do is essentially, I've added here as a little bonus. So this is that Critic paper that I've been referring to. The full title is Critic, Large Language Models Can Self-Correct with Tool Interactive Critiquing. This is again by Zhibin et al. 2023. I believe it's published in ICLR, though, 2024. So, essentially what the main results of that paper are that Critic leads to, substantial improvements over a baseline. So when you do use reflection, you see substantial gains in a variety of tasks. So QA, math, and they did toxicity reduction. Again, we're following the toxicity reduction example that they did in their paper, so we're essentially replicating it to a certain degree. The second main result that I pulled out from that paper was that feedback is very crucial for, feedback from external tools is very crucial to this process of performing tasks. So if you do have tools that you can make use of and are appropriate for the task, then you should make use of them because they will lead, or they should lead to better results than not using them. And then the last main result is Critic performs better with stronger LLMs. So they tested here Text DaVinci 003 versus GPT 3.5 Turbo, and they found it to perform better on the better model, which was GPT 3.5 Turbo. And yeah, in these paper cards, I essentially go through other things. So I go through the contributions, the insights, and then I do a little bit of an illustration of the technical bits. So you can see here again with Critic, you've got an initial response or output, then you go through a reflection or critique phase, then you go through a correction phase based upon that critique, and you do that in cycles until a stopping criteria is met. Again, in that paper, they use Perspective API, which we are also doing here. Okay, so that's the paper card. Again, just a visualization that I like to create whenever I read a paper that I feel I would like to remember, key takeaways from in the future. Okay, so good timing. So essentially that loop has finished, and we've displayed the results in a data frame. And you can see here is the improved text, here is the reflection type, and the original text you can see is 49 toxicity score according to Perspective, and with tool interactive reflection it gets down to 1.15. The same example using self-reflection goes down to 5.5, and then we so on and so forth. So you can see across the board essentially that both reflection mechanisms leads to a drastic improvement over the original text, which is good. So the agent is doing its job, and reflection is having an effect. And just for comparison's sake here, what we'll do is we'll group by the reflection method and take the average of the improved toxicity score, and we see self-reflection has a slightly higher toxicity score than does tool reflection has. And as I mentioned before, that's essentially the observation that the authors pointed out in their paper as well, and I mentioned here in this key result too. Of course, they did it across 3 different examples with many more examples for each case study, and so their observations are probably more closer to statistical significance than ours here, but nevertheless, it is again in agreement with what the authors observed. So, in summary, this is the Introspective Agent notebook where we've introduced the Introspective Agent class that performs tasks using reflection, and in our implementation, an Introspective Agent delegates a task to a main worker agent that performs the task to get the initial response, and then that initial response gets passed to another reflective agent that performs reflection and correction cycles. And in that package, we also have, again, self-reflection and tool interactive reflection. And you can see here, which again is in agreement with the Critic paper, if you do have appropriate tools that you can use to perform the reflection, then you should make use of it, because it seems that using external tools for reflection does net out better results. And that's it for today, folks. Hope you enjoyed the notebook, and if you have any questions or comments, then feel free to submit an issue in GitHub or reach out to us in our Discord. Thanks